The arrival at Galactic Academy. Jackson Mayfield stood frozen at the entrance of the Galactic Academy, a place of unimaginable grandeur and awe. The shimmering crystal doors stretched above him like the gates of another world, towering far beyond anything on Earth. His heart thudded in his chest as he gazed up, feeling small in the vastness of the structure before him. He had dreamed of this moment his entire life, but now that it was real, it felt almost surreal. As his hand hovered over the scanner plate, a brief moment of hesitation gnawed at him. Could a human truly belong in such a place? With a soft, melodic hum, the doors began to open. A rush of cool air, infused with strange, unfamiliar scents, greeted him. The instant he stepped inside, his eyes were met with a sight he would never forget. Beings from countless worlds, tall, short, multicolored, and beyond, moving in and out of the corridors with ease. They glided, floated, and walked, each one exuding a presence that was at once beautiful and intimidating. But none of them resembled him. Human, he muttered to himself, trying to steel his nerves. There were no humans here. He was the first. He had been selected to attend the Galactic Academy because of his potential, his unique ability to learn quickly, to process information faster than others. But that didn't stop the gnawing voice in his head that whispered doubts. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his world. Jackson's wrist device beeped, pulling him from his thoughts. The small silver chip he carried in his palm glowed with a soft blue light as the scanning system processed his identity. Jackson Mayfield, Earth, first-year student. The voice said, its mechanical tone carrying no emotion. A low hum vibrated through the floor as a blue beam shot up and down his body, confirming his identity. Human biology confirmed. Welcome to Galactic Academy. First human student. Jackson winced at the mechanical voice, feeling like an experiment on display. It was official. He was the first human to set foot in an academy meant for beings from all over the universe, and he had no idea what would come next. As the crystal doors slid shut behind him, Jackson stepped forward, trying to ignore the many eyes that followed him. The hallway stretched out before him like an endless corridor of possibilities, each door leading to new experiences, new opportunities, and no doubt new challenges. He could hear the hum of activity all around him, but most of the voices were hushed, murmuring in languages he could barely understand. Then he heard it, soft whispers, a mix of clicks and strange, melodic hums. He turned, realizing the alien students were talking about him. He didn't need to understand their words to know the meaning behind them. They were confused, some skeptical, others outright dismissive. How did a human get in here? One voice whispered, its owner watching him from across the hall. Humans are barely a level 2 civilization. They only achieved space travel a century ago. Jackson fought to keep his composure. He knew the truth. Humans were far more capable than they appeared. But this galaxy didn't know that. They thought Earth was a primitive, underdeveloped world, and perhaps in some ways, they were right. But that was about to change. He was here to show them that humanity wasn't just another species waiting to catch up. They were capable of far more than anyone realized. Is that really a human? Another voice asked, this one coming from an alien with crystalline skin, whose features flickered with every movement. The whispers grew louder, but Jackson pushed forward. He had to ignore them, to focus on what lay ahead. His goal wasn't to prove them wrong, but to prove himself. Prove that humans could stand shoulder to shoulder with the most advanced species in the galaxy. Suddenly, a figure stepped into his path. The alien was tall, with shimmering silver skin that rippled like water. His body was sleek, his movements fluid and precise, almost as though he were dancing. 6 long, elegant arms extended in greeting, his face unreadable but curious. You look lost, the alien said, his voice smooth, almost melodic. Despite the way his features shimmered and shifted, there was a softness in his eyes that made Jackson feel welcome. First day, Jackson replied, forcing a smile despite the flutter of nerves in his stomach. "It's obvious, isn't it?" The alien skin flickered with amused yellow patterns. "Is it?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "I'm Kale, from the Zentler system. You're the human, right?" Jackson nodded. "That's me, Jackson Mayfield. From Earth." "Earth," Kale repeated, his skin turning a soft lavender. "You know, I've read a lot about your species. There's a lot of curiosity surrounding humans, but also a fair amount of skepticism. Many think your species isn't quite ready for the galactic stage." His voice dropped slightly. "But I've heard that you've shown remarkable potential." Jackson couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. "I didn't come here to prove them wrong," he said quietly. "I came to prove that we belong." Kale tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I like that answer. Come with me, Jackson. I'll show you around." As they walked through the academy, Jackson couldn't help but marvel at the sheer scale of it. The walls pulsed with soft, glowing lights, and holographic screens hovered in midair, displaying all sorts of alien symbols and equations Jackson could barely decipher. Students flowed in and out of classrooms, while others hovered or glided on platforms. But despite the majesty of the place, Jackson couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him, curious, judgmental, or outright skeptical. He knew that the whispers wouldn't stop. He had to prove that he belonged here, even if no one believed it. They stopped in front of a large, circular hall filled with floating desks and high-tech devices. The door slid open with a gentle whoosh, and Kale gestured for Jackson to enter. "Your first class is quantum engineering," Kale said, his voice calm and reassuring. "This will be your first real test. The academy is about challenge, about pushing you to your limits. But don't worry, I'll be there to help." Jackson swallowed hard. Quantum engineering was a subject he had only dreamed of mastering. But here, in the heart of the galaxy, he would be competing with beings whose minds worked in ways that were far beyond his understanding. As he entered the classroom, he saw students of every imaginable shape and form. Some had wings, some were made entirely of light, while others appeared to be made of liquid or energy. In the center stood an imposing figure, their form constantly shifting, neither entirely humanoid nor alien. The professor's presence alone made the air feel heavy. Kale nudged him gently. "Don't let them intimidate you. Just focus. You can do this." Jackson took a deep breath, adjusting his wrist device. He wasn't just here to survive. He was here to show them all that humanity wasn't just another species. They were capable of greatness. And he would prove it, one lesson at a time. Strangers in a new world. The halls of the Galactic Academy were alive with energy, unlike anything Jackson had ever experienced on Earth. The architecture alone was enough to make him dizzy, with the walls curving and bending in ways that defied the laws of physics as he understood them. Holographic images floated above him, displaying complex alien languages, intergalactic maps, and vast cosmic phenomena. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like the charge before a storm, and Jackson could feel the electric hum of the Academy's core systems reverberating beneath his feet. As Jackson walked further into the main hall, the sheer diversity of the beings around him became overwhelming. Some students had eyes that glowed like the stars, while others had multiple faces, each one expressing a different emotion. There were creatures whose bodies shifted in size depending on their mood, and beings that seemed entirely translucent, their internal structures visible like a living X-ray. The sight was both awe-inspiring and intimidating, reminding him just how out of place he was in this strange new world. Jackson couldn't help but notice the way some of the students glanced at him. Their eyes lingered just a little too long, their conversations quieting as he passed. It was subtle, but it was there, the feeling that he was being sized up, studied. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the path ahead of him, but no matter how hard he tried to blend in, he stood out. He was the only human in the entire academy, the first of his kind to be granted a spot at such a prestigious institution, and it was clear that many of the other students didn't know what to make of him. Suddenly, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Is it true?" the voice asked, filled with curiosity and disbelief. Jackson turned to see a tall, slender being standing behind him, their skin shifting between deep shades of purple and blue. Their eyes were large, almost too big for their face, and they had an ethereal quality, as though they were both present and somehow apart from the world around them. "Is what true?" Jackson asked, trying to remain calm. The alien raised an eyebrow, his voice soft but laced with suspicion. "That you're the first human to ever attend the academy. That you're a level 2 species." Jackson felt a jolt of anger rise within him. He didn't like how they referred to humans as level 2, as if they were something less. But he couldn't let that anger show. Not now, not here. Instead, he forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's true," he said quietly. "I'm here to learn, just like you." The alien studied him for a moment, their shimmering skin shifting through hues of silver and white. "I've heard your species barely understand the fundamental laws of physics. How could you possibly keep up with us?" The words stung, but Jackson held his ground. "I guess you'll just have to wait and see," he said, turning away from the alien without waiting for a response. As he walked on, his mind raced. He knew they didn't believe in human potential. Most of them thought humans were primitive, underdeveloped. And maybe in some ways, that was true. But there was more to humanity than these species realized. Jackson's very presence here was proof of that. The galaxy had underestimated Earth, but it was time for humanity to show them what they were truly capable of. He continued down the hall, his thoughts interrupted by a strange sound. A soft clicking, like the rhythmic tapping of fingers against glass. It was coming from a nearby group of students, each of them sitting perfectly still. Their bodies were made of rough, jagged stone, their faces expressionless as they communicated through quick flashes of light and soft, melodic hums. They barely seemed to acknowledge Jackson's presence, but their eyes flickered toward him as he passed, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of their unspoken thoughts. "Don't mind them." Cal's voice broke through his thoughts. He had appeared at Jackson's side again, his 6 arms floating casually by his sides. "They're there. They communicate through light and sound, but they don't usually speak much to outsiders. They've been here longer than most." Jackson gave a small nod, though he felt uncomfortable under their gaze. "Are they judging me?" he asked quietly. Cal shrugged, his skin shifting to a calming shade of green. "Not exactly. They're just observing. The Duther are quiet by nature, but when they do speak, they have a lot of wisdom to share. They'll judge you by your actions, not your species." Jackson wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. He didn't want to be judged by anything other than his own merits, but the weight of their silence was harder to ignore than he'd anticipated. Cal, sensing his discomfort, led him onward through the hall, offering a comforting smile. "You'll get used to it," Cal said, though his tone held a hint of uncertainty. "It's always like this for new students. You'll have to prove yourself over and over again, but don't let it get to you. There are a few here who won't hesitate to tear you down, but there are others, like me, who will help you rise." Jackson appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't sure anyone could truly understand what it was like to be human in a galaxy full of beings who viewed humans as beneath them. He was here to prove that humanity wasn't just some fledgling species, it was capable of much more, and he was going to show them all, no matter how many stares or whispers it took. As they entered another wing of the academy, the air grew cooler, and the walls seemed to pulse with a soft, rhythmic hum. It was a strange sensation, as though the entire building itself was alive, aware of everything that transpired within it. Jackson's wrist device buzzed again, signaling that it was time for his next class. "Quantum mechanics with Professor Thull," Cal said, glancing at the glowing schedule on his own wrist device. "You'll like him. He's different." Jackson wasn't sure what Cal meant by that, but he was eager to see what this next class would bring. He had spent years studying quantum physics on Earth, but nothing could prepare him for what awaited him in the classroom. Cale led him to a large, spherical chamber filled with students seated around floating desks. The center of the room was dominated by a massive, rotating holographic display of a distant star system. At the front stood a being with translucent skin, whose features shifted in a way that made it seem as though they were constantly changing. Their body was a soft blue, and their eyes gleamed with an intensity that made Jackson feel as though they could see straight through him. "Ah, the human has arrived," the professor said, their voice soothing but firm. "Welcome, Jackson Mayfield, to the study of the very fabric of the universe itself. Today, we shall begin with the concept of dimensional physics and the manipulation of quantum fields." Jackson's heart quickened as he took his seat, eager to dive into the complexities of quantum theory. But as the professor began speaking, explaining advanced concepts in a language that was somehow both familiar and foreign, Jackson realized just how much he had to learn, and how much further he had to go to truly belong here. It wasn't just about understanding the science. It was about proving that humanity could push the boundaries of knowledge and technology, just as the other species had done for millennia. Jackson knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready. He had no choice but to be ready. The galaxy was watching. The first class, Quantum Engineering. Jackson stood at the threshold of the quantum engineering classroom, his nerves tangled in a knot of excitement and apprehension. The room was unlike any classroom he had ever encountered. Instead of traditional desks or tables, the floor was a smooth metallic surface that reflected the light from floating holographic screens. At the center of the room, a large spherical platform hovered in midair, surrounded by pulsating energy fields that crackled with electric potential. There was a hum in the air, the kind that vibrated deep in his chest, as though the very room was alive, feeding on the energy of the students and their thoughts. He took a step forward, and the soft chime of a door closing echoed behind him. The holographic screens around the room shimmered as they adjusted to the arrival of a new student. The atmosphere inside felt thick with anticipation, and Jackson could sense that the others in the room were already aware of his presence, their eyes flickering toward him with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. But this time, it was different. They weren't whispering about him. They were watching him as a competitor. "Jackson Mayfield," the voice of the instructor rang out, its tones warm but commanding. "Welcome to Quantum Engineering. I am Professor Thull, and I will be guiding you through the fundamental laws of manipulating the universe's most potent forces." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He had read all the books, studied all the theories back on Earth, but standing here in a room with students from across the galaxy, it felt surreal. Some of the students in the room were already absorbed in their work, their hands moving in intricate patterns above glowing control panels. Others hovered in the air, their limbs floating effortlessly as they worked through calculations, their minds apparently so attuned to the laws of physics that they barely needed to move a muscle. Professor Thull was a being unlike any Jackson had ever seen. His body seemed to shift between different phases of matter, now solid, now gaseous, his form flickering in and out of existence. His translucent skin shimmered with an iridescent glow, and his long, fluid arms moved with an eerie grace. His face was both alien and familiar, with eyes that seemed to hold the entire universe within them. "You are about to enter a field that has the power to bend space, shake time, and create the very stars themselves." Thull's voice boomed, drawing Jackson's focus back to the lesson. "But with that power comes great responsibility. It is not enough to know the equations or understand the theory. You must feel the forces of the universe, mold them with your will. You must create harmony." Jackson felt his mind racing. This was it. This was what he had dreamed of, what he had worked his entire life to achieve. He had studied quantum mechanics until his eyes burned and his brain ached. But here, in this room full of extraterrestrial prodigies, he was about to face the real test. "Today," Thull continued, We begin with the manipulation of star-forming energy. The task is simple. Create a stable, self-sustaining quantum reaction. But be warned. Too much power, and it will collapse. Too little, and it will flicker out of existence. You must strike a balance. As he spoke, holographic representations of miniature stars appeared above each student's workstation, glowing softly. The stars flickered in and out of existence as though they were alive, pulsing with energy. Jackson's wrist device buzzed, displaying a set of instructions, but the instructions meant little compared to the sensation of the room itself. The energy in the air was tangible, like static electricity before a storm. "Begin," Professor Thull said simply, and the room was filled with the sound of students manipulating their controls. Jackson's heart raced as he stood before his workstation. He had watched countless videos of this process, practiced simulations on Earth, but now it was real. He could feel the intensity of the moment settle over him, the weight of all the expectations, both his own and those of the galaxy, pressing down on him. This was his chance to prove that humanity was more than just an afterthought in the cosmic order. Jackson's hands hovered above the controls, his fingers twitching slightly as he adjusted the energy fields, guiding the tiny point of light that represented the nascent star. He could feel the warmth emanating from it as if it were a living entity. Slowly, cautiously, he began to increase the energy flow, watching as the light intensified, slowly coalescing into a more stable form. Around him, the other students worked in silence, their focus absolute. Some of them were already far ahead, their miniature stars burning with steady intensity, while others struggled, their creations flickering weakly. Jackson could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their scrutiny heavy on his shoulders. He knew they didn't think he belonged here, didn't think a human could possibly match their level of understanding. But he didn't care. He couldn't care. This was his moment, and he was going to make it count. With a deep breath, Jackson made his first big adjustment, tweaking the energy levels just enough to create a reaction that was more stable. The star flickered, its light beginning to glow with an almost imperceptible steadiness. A few of the students nearby glanced over at him, their eyes narrowing with interest, but Jackson focused on the task at hand. For a long moment, everything was still. The only sound was the gentle hum of the energy fields and the steady pulse of his miniature star as it stabilized. Jackson's mind raced, moving from one adjustment to the next, guided by a deep intuition that he had never fully understood. It was as if the energy itself was responding to him, listening to his commands, as if it recognized him as its master. Then suddenly, a loud sound pierced the silence. A sharp alarm. Professor Thull's voice cut through the noise. "Warning, instability detected in Sector 5. Containment breach imminent." Jackson's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see one of the students' stars growing larger, its energy spiraling out of control. The light was too bright, too intense. It pulsed erratically, and for a moment, it looked as though it might explode. "Containment failure," the student shouted, panic clear in their voice. Jackson's instincts kicked in. He didn't think. He acted. Without a second thought, he reached out, adjusting the settings on his panel, pushing the energy back into balance. His fingers moved with speed and precision, his mind working faster than it ever had before. It was like he could see the equation in his mind, the way the energy flowed and reacted, the way it bent to his will. The other students were still struggling to maintain their stars, and the professor was moving toward the out-of-control reaction. But Jackson didn't hesitate. He had to do this. For humanity. For himself. With a final, precise movement, the energy stabilized. The pulsing light turned from a chaotic red to a steady, glowing blue. The alarm stopped. The room fell into complete silence. Jackson sat back, breathless but victorious. The star before him burned brightly, its energy stable and self-sustaining. Professor Thull's eyes locked onto Jackson. "Remarkable," the professor said, his voice filled with an emotion Jackson couldn't quite place. You managed to stabilize the reaction faster than any student I've ever had, including those from far more advanced civilizations. Jackson couldn't believe what he was hearing. A human, a level 2 species. He had just performed better than beings who had mastered the universe's most complex forces. As he looked around, he saw it. The others were no longer whispering. They were watching him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Kale, who had been seated next to him, flashed a glowing yellow pattern of approval. Jackson's heart swelled with pride. But he knew this was just the beginning. The galaxy was watching, and it was time for humanity to show them that they belonged. A trial of skill and will. The following weeks at the Galactic Academy blurred together in a whirlwind of classes, assignments, and personal challenges. Jackson's reputation began to grow, though not always for the reasons he had hoped. Every day he found himself facing new hurdles, intellectual, emotional, and social. The galaxy's greatest minds had been gathered in one place, and he, the lone human, was expected to keep up with their prodigious talents. But it wasn't just the classwork that made Jackson's heart race. It was the growing tension between him and many of the other students. Though some had come to respect his abilities, especially after the impressive quantum stabilization during the first class, others weren't so forgiving. Whispers followed him in every hallway, and alien students often stared at him from afar, their eyes filled with judgment or intrigue. Jackson knew that most of them saw him as nothing more than an outsider, a curiosity, someone who had accidentally stumbled into their world. And yet, there were a few who seemed genuinely willing to stand by him. Kale, of course, had proven to be a supportive friend, always offering advice or a word of encouragement when Jackson felt overwhelmed. But even Kale, despite his friendly demeanor, couldn't escape the fact that he too was constantly being pulled in different directions. Kale's allegiance, Jackson knew, wasn't as simple as it appeared. He was from the Zenthar system, a species with a long history of diplomatic involvement in the Galactic Council, and had a reputation to uphold. Jackson wasn't sure how much longer that would last, especially if the whispers about him continued. But it wasn't just the students that Jackson had to worry about. The faculty, too, had begun to take notice. Professor Thull, his quantum engineering instructor, seemed increasingly intrigued by his progress. The alien professor had a way of observing Jackson that felt like an evaluation, constantly probing his understanding of complex topics with subtle questions and challenges. It wasn't just about grades. It was as if Thull was testing Jackson in ways that weren't entirely clear, pushing him to uncover something more, something hidden beneath the surface of his academic abilities. Jackson had learned to embrace the challenge, but he also knew that it was only a matter of time before things would get complicated. He could feel it in the air, in the conversations that paused when he entered a room, in the way some students started to distance themselves from him. The pressure was mounting, and he knew that eventually his true test would come, not in a classroom, but in a trial that would define his place in the academy and perhaps in the galaxy itself. The day of the trial arrived sooner than he expected. It had been announced 2 weeks earlier, the annual academic trials, a competition between the brightest students from each year of the academy. The trials were legendary across the galaxy, a test of both intellect and ingenuity, where only the best could succeed. The trials would test their ability to solve complex problems, their physical endurance, and their creativity in overcoming obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The stakes were high. Those who performed well would earn prestige for their species and guarantee a place in the upper echelons of galactic society. Failure, on the other hand, meant public disgrace and the risk of being sent back to their homeworlds with nothing more than a failure stamped on their records. Jackson wasn't sure why he had been chosen to participate in the first place. He had barely finished a month at the academy. And yet, here he was, standing in a large arena surrounded by students from every corner of the galaxy. The atmosphere was electric, thick with tension and anticipation. The Academy's central hall had been transformed into a massive futuristic competition space, with sleek metal platforms, swirling energy fields, and towering screens that flickered with holographic displays. At the center of the arena stood the Galactic Council members, their stern eyes scanning the participants with cold precision. They were a collection of beings from various advanced species, each with their own history and agenda. Jackson recognized a few of them from his classes, professors who had been at the academy for centuries, their knowledge far beyond what he could comprehend. They were the judges, and they held the power to decide the fate of every student who dared to compete. Jackson stood in line with the other competitors, his heart pounding in his chest. His wrist device buzzed, signaling that the first event was about to begin. He glanced around nervously, seeing his competitors, each of them exuding confidence and skill. There were students from the Trellick system, a race of beings who could manipulate sound and frequency with their minds. There were the Xerok, towering giants with advanced brute strength and a natural affinity for engineering. And then there was Hyena, a top-tier student with striking blue skin and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through him. She was a member of the Severan elite, and from the moment Jackson had arrived at the academy, it was clear she had her eyes set on the top spot. As the first event began, Jackson tried to shake off the feeling that he was being watched from all directions. The challenge was complex. They had to navigate through a series of obstacles that simulated real-world survival situations. The students were given a set of tools and must complete the course in the shortest time possible. It was a test of both physical and mental resilience, qualities that Jackson had honed throughout his life on Earth. But as Jackson worked his way through the obstacles, it became clear that the challenges were designed not only to test their skill but their ability to adapt. The terrain shifted constantly. Some areas were filled with shifting gravity, others with sudden bursts of extreme heat or cold. The obstacles were unlike anything Jackson had ever seen before, and yet he thrived in this environment. He quickly adjusted to the changing conditions, using every resource available to him. His problem-solving skills, his ability to think on his feet, and his human ingenuity. But just as he thought he was in the clear, disaster struck. A massive wall of energy surged toward him, and the ground beneath his feet began to crack and break apart. The force field that separated the contestants from the judges flared to life, sending a pulse of energy through the air. In the chaos, Jackson lost his footing, stumbling toward the edge of a chasm that opened beneath him. His heart stopped for a moment as he teetered on the brink of the abyss. Then something extraordinary happened. Without thinking, Jackson reached out with his hands, grabbing onto the energy field in front of him. In a flash, the energy field responded, shifting and bending to his will. Jackson felt a rush of electricity surge through his fingertips, but instead of being burned, it flowed through him, aligning with his movements. He used the field as a tool, propelling himself forward with strength and precision that amazed even him. The judges and the other students watched in stunned silence as Jackson leaped across the chasm, landing safely on the other side, his body glowing with the energy of his victory. He had done it. He had adapted in a way no one had expected, using his human ingenuity to manipulate the environment in ways that were beyond what anyone had thought possible. When the trial ended, Jackson found himself standing in front of the Academy's council, his chest heaving with adrenaline. The other competitors had completed the course, but none with the grace or brilliance that Jackson had displayed. Even Hyena, who was known for her unmatched abilities, had faltered in the final obstacle. "You were impressive," said one of the council members, their voice cold but tinged with awe. "Your methods were unconventional, but effective. Humanity may not be as far behind as we thought." Jackson stood tall, feeling the weight of their words settle over him. It wasn't just about surviving the trial. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity had its place among the stars. He wasn't just some student from a backwater planet. He was a force to be reckoned with. As he walked off the stage, Kale was waiting for him, his skin glowing with pride. "That was incredible," he said, flashing a pattern of bright yellow. "You really showed them, Jackson." Jackson smiled, but inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The trials were far from over, and with each passing challenge, The stakes grew higher. The galaxy had watched him perform the impossible, but now Jackson had to prove that this wasn't just a fluke. He had to show them that humanity wasn't just here to stay, it was here to lead. The hidden challenges. The days after the first trial passed quickly, leaving Jackson with little time to reflect on the intense experience. The Galactic Academy was a whirlwind of activity, and with every passing day, he found himself pulled in 100 different directions. His success in the initial trial had earned him respect from some, and suspicion from others. But there was no time to bask in his victory. New challenges were on the horizon, and Jackson was quickly learning that nothing at the Academy was as simple as it appeared. Kale, as always, was there to offer his support. The Zenthar student had become Jackson's most trusted ally since his arrival, and although Kel's species was known for their diplomatic prowess and vast intelligence, he seemed to be a rare exception, more focused on the future than the past. In the days that followed, Kel had often been the one to guide Jackson through the maze of cultural differences, helping him navigate the various social expectations and even the intricacies of certain classes that were too advanced for him to fully grasp. But even Kel had his limits. There were things Jackson had to face on his own, and it was during the second trial that he began to realize how far he still had to go. The second event of the academic trials was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was designed to test not just intelligence, but adaptability, how well the students could think on their feet and solve problems under extreme pressure. The challenge took place in an enormous open-air arena with the stars visible in the sky above. The vastness of the setting was almost overwhelming. The arena was surrounded by a series of interconnected platforms, each designed with a different environmental hazard meant to test the students' skills in surviving the most extreme conditions. Jackson's wrist device buzzed with an alert, indicating that the event was about to begin. He stood at the starting line, surrounded by his fellow competitors. There was Hyena, her piercing blue eyes locked onto him, as if she were measuring his every move. She was still the reigning champion, and the rest of the students expected her to come out on top once again. But this time, Jackson wasn't the only one watching her. She had seen his performance in the first trial, and though she didn't show it, he knew she was preparing for something more than a simple contest of skill. This time, the trials weren't just about talent. They were about survival. As the starting signal was given, the platforms beneath their feet activated, and the arena shifted. The environment changed, almost instantly, from a serene landscape into an inhospitable terrain. The ground beneath Jackson's feet cracked open, and he found himself standing on a narrow platform suspended over a vast, churning ocean of liquid metal. The heat was unbearable, and the air shimmered with the intensity of the molten substance below. "This is insane," Jackson muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his brow. The trial had just begun, and already it felt like it was pushing him to the limits of his endurance. The objective was simple: navigate the platforms to the far side of the arena without falling into the molten sea below. But as Jackson began to move, he realized just how deceptive the challenge was. The platforms were unstable, shifting as they moved, and the heat from the molten ocean created unpredictable waves of turbulence in the air. The wind, fierce and biting, whipped through the arena, making it difficult to keep his footing. Jackson's mind raced as he surveyed the first obstacle. He needed to act fast, but he couldn't rush. One wrong move, and he would plunge into the boiling sea below, and with it, any chance of advancing in the trials. He glanced around at the other students. Some were already moving across the platforms with practiced ease, their bodies shifting with the environment. Hyena, of course, was already in the lead, her movements fluid and confident. Jackson gritted his teeth. She was an elite student. He knew she would be tough to beat, but he wasn't going to let that intimidate him. Taking a deep breath, he focused on the task at hand. He adjusted his stance, bracing himself against the wind. The platforms were floating just above the liquid metal, moving in a pattern he hadn't anticipated. He would have to time his movements perfectly. Suddenly, A violent tremor shook the ground, and a massive wave of molten metal surged upward, nearly knocking him off his feet. Jackson's eyes widened in shock. The challenge was escalating, and the risk was growing with every passing second. But it wasn't just about surviving. It was about staying calm and thinking on his feet. He had trained for moments like this. A flash of light to his right caught his attention. One of the platforms began to crack under the pressure, and a student from the Trilix system, a young woman named Elia, fell into the molten ocean. Her screams echoed as she plunged into the depths, disappearing from view. The announcer's voice echoed through the arena. Elia has been eliminated. Survival is paramount. This is not a race to the finish, but a test of resilience. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed aside the fear and focused on the task at hand. He didn't have time to worry about the others. He needed to survive. Another platform began to shift beneath him, its surface cracking open. With a quick, calculated leap, Jackson jumped to the next platform, his feet just missing the edge of the chasm. He landed hard, but the momentum sent him skidding across the surface. His wrist device beeped a warning, indicating that his remaining time was running low. He had to make it to the other side soon, or he would be disqualified. The heat was unbearable, and his body screamed for relief, but he couldn't afford to stop. As he neared the last section of the arena, he saw Hyena ahead of him, already crossing the final platform with swift, graceful movements. She had always been the one to beat, but today, something in Jackson's chest sparked. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to prove something, not just to her, but to the entire galaxy. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jackson pushed himself forward, taking the last platform in a daring leap. The final stretch was within reach, and the molten sea roiled below, but Jackson could feel the wind pushing him forward as if it were aiding him. He landed just inches from the edge, but before he could even catch his breath, the entire arena shook again, a final challenge testing their resolve. Hyena, who had been almost at the finish line, stumbled as the platform beneath her feet buckled. Her eyes flashed with irritation, but she quickly regained her composure, her body flowing effortlessly as she completed the final stretch and landed on solid ground. Jackson wasn't far behind. He made his final leap, and the moment his feet hit the ground, the platform beneath him vanished into the molten sea, leaving only a trail of smoke behind. The announcer's voice echoed in the arena. "Jackson Mayfield, you have completed the challenge in record time. Hyena Severin, you are the first to cross the finish line." Though Hyena had crossed first, Jackson's performance had stunned the judges. He had faced the molten challenge head-on, navigating each obstacle with precision and showing a level of determination that even the seasoned competitors had to admire. Breathing heavily, Jackson approached the final platform, his mind whirling with the realization of what he had just accomplished. This wasn't just about winning. This was about surviving, proving that humanity had something unique to offer, something beyond what anyone could have expected. Hyena glanced at him as he crossed the finish line. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, respect, or perhaps acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. For the first time, Jackson felt like he wasn't just a student in the academy. He was becoming part of something greater. The trial wasn't over yet, but Jackson had shown that he was no longer just the outsider. He was someone to be reckoned with.